Have you ever been made to feel small, like you were nothing more than dirt on someone's expensive shoe? Casey felt that way every single day of her engagement. Her fiancé's family didn't just dislike her, they loathed her. They mocked her. Thrift store clothes laughed at her job and called her a gold digger to her face. At her own engagement dinner, the humiliation hit its peak. They pushed her until she broke. But they made one fatal calculation. They assumed Casey was poor. They didn't know that the text message she just received wasn't from a debt collector. It was from the pilot of a $65 million Gulfstream G650ER, waiting on the tarmac with her true identity. Buckle up. This is the story of how the poor waitress taught a dynasty a lesson they will never forget. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of the 2014 Honda Civic, a sound that seemed deafeningly loud against the hushed, manicured silence of the Sterling estate. Casey gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Beside her, James reached out and covered her hand with his. "It's going to be fine," James said, though his voice lacked conviction. He was a good man, or at least he tried to be. But he was a Sterling, and in Newport, Rhode Island, that name carried a weight that could crush bone. Mother promised she'd behave. "It's just a dinner, Casey. Just family." "Just family who thinks I'm after your trust fund," Casey replied, her voice tight. She smoothed down the skirt of her dress. It was a simple navy A-line she'd bought at a terrifying discount at a department store outlet. She thought it looked elegant. Against the backdrop of the Sterling mansion, a sprawling limestone beast with ivy climbing its turrets, it felt like a dish rag. "They don't know you like I do," James soothed, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Once they see your heart, the money won't matter." Casey forced a smile. If only it were that simple. They stepped out of the car. The humidity was stifling, but Casey felt a chill. Standing on the massive portico were the welcoming committee Victoria Sterling, the matriarch, and her daughter Beatrice. Victoria was a woman carved from ice and diamonds. She wore a vintage Chanel suit that likely cost more than Casey's entire college tuition. Beatrice, a year older than James, was her mother's clone, sharper Mina, and holding a glass of Chardonnay at 4:00 p.m. "James, darling." Victoria swept down the stairs, bypassing Casey entirely to embrace her son. She kissed both his cheeks, leaving a smudge of crimson lipstick. "You're late. The caterers are already anxious." Traffic was bad coming off the bridge. "Mother," James said, stepping back to pull Casey forward. "You remember Casey." Victoria's eyes slid to Casey. It was a physical inspection, cold and clinical. She looked at Casey's scuffed heels, the slightly frayed hem of her dress, and finally her face. "Of course," Victoria said, her tone flat. "The artist, is that what we're calling it this week? I'm working freelance graphic design now." "Mrs. Sterling," Casey said, keeping her chin up. "And picking up shifts at the bistro on weekends." Beatrice snorted into her wine glass. "A bistro? How quaint. I suppose someone has to serve the food. I just never thought James would bring the help home through the front door." James stiffened. "Beatrice, that's enough." "It's fine, James," Casey said quietly, though her stomach churned. "Let's just go inside." The interior of the house was a museum of old money. Oil paintings of ancestors who looked constipated lined the halls. The air smelled of beeswax and judgment. As they walked toward the drawing room, Casey felt the familiar weight of her secret pressing against her chest. She wasn't just Casey the waitress. She was Casey Whitmore, the only heir to the Whitmore logistics empire, a global shipping conglomerate that made the sterling family fortune look like pocket change. She had walked away from it all 3 years ago, tired of fake friends and fortune hunters. She wanted to be loved for herself, not her father's private island. She had found James. He was sweet, kind, and seemingly different from the sharks she grew up with. But his family, they were the exact monsters she had run away from. And tonight, she had a terrible feeling the monster was hungry. Dinner was a torture session disguised as a meal. The table was set with silverware so heavy, Casey worried she'd drop it. There were 5 courses each, smaller and more pretentious than the last. Sitting across from Casey was Richard James's father. He was a silent man who communicated mostly in grunts and checks written to make problems go away. Beside him was Alistair Beatrice's husband, a hedge fund manager who spent the entire appetizer course bragging about shorting a pharmaceutical stock. So, Victoria began slicing into her squab with surgical precision. Casey, James tells us you're living in that dreadful apartment complex downtown, the one near the train tracks. It's not dreadful, Casey defended, putting down her fork. It's cozy, and the rent is reasonable. Reasonable, Beatrice echoed, rolling her eyes. James, you can't possibly intend to live there after the wedding. It's a safety hazard. I heard someone was mugged 2 blocks away last week. We haven't decided on housing yet, James muttered, taking a large gulp of wine. Casey looked at him, willing him to be stronger. To say, I don't care where we live as long as I'm with her. But he didn't. He just looked at his plate. Well, you certainly aren't staying there, Victoria declared. Richard and I have decided to gift you the east wing of the estate. You'll live here, under our supervision. Casey's fork clattered against the china. Mrs. Sterling, that is very generous, but James and I want to build our own life, independently. Victoria laughed, a dry, brittle sound. Independently? With what funds? Dear, your bistro tips. James's allowance. Let's be realistic. You are marrying into this family. You will abide by our standards. We can't have a Sterling living in squalor. It's not squalor. Casey snapped, her patience fraying. It is to us, Beatrice interjected. Actually, Casey said, reaching under her chair for the small bag she had brought. Speaking of the wedding and family, I wanted to give you this, a token of appreciation for hosting tonight. She placed the bag on the table. It was a simple paper gift bag with tissue paper. Victoria looked at it as if it might explode. She pinched the tissue paper and pulled out the object inside. It was a framed watercolor painting. Casey had spent weeks on it. It depicted the Sterling estate garden in full bloom, focusing on the rose bushes Victoria was famously proud of. It was delicate, thoughtful, and deeply personal. Victoria held it up. Silence descended on the table. Did you paint this? Victoria asked. Yes. Casey smiled, hoping for a breakthrough. I know how much you love the roses. Victoria stared at it for another second, then dropped the frame onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud, face down. How charmingly rustic, Victoria said, wiping her hands on a napkin as if the painting had soiled them. It looks like something a child would bring home from summer camp. Beatrice burst out laughing. Oh, Mother, be nice. She probably couldn't afford a real gift. Art supplies are cheap, right? It's sentimental, Casey whispered, her face burning. Sentimental doesn't pay for the heating bill, dear. Richard spoke up for the first time, his voice gruff. James, is this really the best you could do? A girl who paints pictures and waits tables. She's talented. Dad, James said weakly. She's a liability, Victoria corrected. Casey. Let's stop the charade. We know why you're here. You found a soft-hearted boy with a big inheritance. You want the clothes, the cars, the status. You think a watercolor painting makes you one of us. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a checkbook. She scribbled something hastily and tore it out. She slid it across the mahogany table toward Casey. $50,000, Victoria said. Take it. Break the engagement. Leave tonight. And never come back. Casey looked at the check. The zeros stared back at her. You think you can buy me? Casey asked, her voice trembling not with sadness, but with a rising volcanic anger. Everyone has a price. Beatrice sneered. Yours is probably a lot lower than 50 grand, but Mother is feeling generous. Casey looked at James. Are you going to let them talk to me like this? James looked pained. Casey, please. Mom put the check away. Casey, just maybe apologize for the painting. Tell them you'll try harder to fit in. The heir left the room. Apologize for the painting. Casey stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. No, she said. Her voice was suddenly steady. The trembling stopped. The waitress was gone. The heiress was waking up. Sit down. You're making a scene, Victoria hissed. I'm done sitting down, Casey said. She picked up the check. $50,000. That's what you think I'm worth. It's more money than you'll see in a lifetime. Beatrice laughed. Casey ripped the check in half, then in quarters. She let the pieces flutter down into her half-eaten soup. I don't want your money, Victoria. I don't want your estate. And sadly, she looked at James, her eyes full of pity. I don't think I want a husband who can't stand up to his own mother. Casey, don't do this, James pleaded, standing up. You're just emotional. I am emotional, James. I'm disappointed. Suddenly, a low, rhythmic vibration buzzed against the table. Casey's phone, face down, next to her water glass, lit up. The screen displayed a name, Captain Halloway, Flight Ops. Casey ignored it. Who's calling you? Beatrice asked, peering at the phone. Debt collector. The phone rang again. Persistent. Casey picked it up. She didn't tap decline. She swiped answer and put it on speaker. This isn't a good time, Casey said into the phone, her eyes locked on Victoria. A crisp British voice filled the silent dining room. The quality of the audio was crystal clear. Miss Whitmore, my apologies for the interruption, the pilot said. But we have a window issue at Teterboro. The flight director wants to know if you'd prefer we bring the Global 7500 to Newport State Airport instead. It's closer to your current location. We can have the car on the tarmac in 20 minutes. The room went dead silent. Victoria froze. Whitmore. Did he say? Whitmore. Newport is fine, Captain, Casey said calmly. And have the ground team ready. I'll be leaving immediately. Copy that, Miss Whitmore. The Global is fueled and catering has been stocked with the 08 Dom Perignon you requested. We are wheels up as soon as you arrive. Casey hung up. She looked around the table. The smirk had vanished from Beatrice's face. Richard was squinting at her, as if trying to solve a complex math problem. Whitmore, Richard muttered. Wait, you aren't related to Jonathan Whitmore. He's my father, Casey said, picking up her clutch. Though I suppose you know him better as the man who acquired your shipping division last quarter. Richard's face drained of color. He went pale grey. The Sterling family shipping business had indeed been bought out recently, a hostile takeover by Whitmore Logistics that had saved the Sterlings from bankruptcy, though they had kept that quiet. That's impossible, Victoria stammered. You drive a Honda. You work at a bistro. I drive a Honda because I like to stay grounded, Casey said, her voice icy. I work at a bistro because I wanted to see if I could make it on my own without my father's name opening every door for me. I wanted to find someone who loved me, not the Whitmore fortune. She turned to James. He looked like he had been struck by lightning. Casey, he whispered, you're a billionaire. I'm Casey, she said sadly. I'm the same girl you drove here with. But apparently that girl wasn't good enough for this table. She needed a bank account to be treated with respect. She walked around the table, her heels clicking on the hardwood. She stopped behind Victoria's chair. By the way, Victoria. Casey leaned down, whispering into the older woman's ear. That watercolor painting, I was going to hang it in the guest house I planned to buy for us. The $14 million estate down the cliff. But you're right. It is too rustic for a sterling. Casey turned to the door. Don't bother seeing me out. My ride is here. As if on cue, the distinct thwop, thwop, thwop of a helicopter rotor began to fade in from the distance, getting louder by the second. Beatrice ran to the window. Mother, there's a Sikorsky landing on the lawn. On the front lawn. Casey didn't look back. She walked out of the dining room, leaving the Sterlings sitting in the ruin of their own arrogance. The manicured lawn of the Sterling estate, usually reserved for croquet and garden parties, had been transformed into a landing zone. The sleek, dark blue Sikorsky S-76 helicopter sat idling its rotors, slicing through the humid Rhode Island air with a deafening thwop, thwop, thwop that shook the antique window panes of the mansion. Casey stepped out the front door. The wind from the rotors whipped her hair back, but she didn't flinch. She felt a strange sense of calm in the chaos. For 3 years, she had made herself small. She had softened her voice, rounded her shoulders, and dulled her shine to make James feel big. No more. 2 men in black tactical suits stepped out of the helicopter. They moved with the fluid precision of Secret Service agents. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Mason, who had been her father's head of security since she was a child, jogged toward her. He didn't look at the house. His eyes were scanning the perimeter. Miss Whitmore, Mason said, his voice cutting through the noise as he offered a hand. Package is secure. Are you injured? Only my pride, Mason, Casey said, her voice steady. Let's go. Behind her, the front door of the mansion burst open. James stumbled out, followed closely by a frantic Victoria and a pale-faced Beatrice. The wind from the helicopter caught Victoria's meticulously sprayed updo, tearing it apart in seconds. She looked less like a queen and more like a scarecrow in Chanel. Casey, wait! James screamed, running toward the aircraft. Casey paused, 1 foot on the helicopter's step. She turned back. James stopped 10 feet away, blocked by the second security officer, who simply held up a hand. The young Sterling heir looked pathetic. His tie was crooked, his face flushed with a mix of alcohol and panic. Casey, please, James yelled over the engine roar. We can talk about this. I didn't know. Why didn't you tell me? Casey looked at him. Really looked at him one last time. Because James, she shouted back, her voice cold and carrying over the wind. I needed to know if you loved me, or if you just loved the idea of saving someone beneath you. And tonight, I got my answer. You didn't defend me when I was a waitress. You don't deserve me, now that I'm a Whitmore. I love you, James cried, tears streaming down his face. I do. No, Casey said, stepping up into the cabin. You love your inheritance, and you just lost the best asset you ever had. She pulled the door shut. The lock engaged with a heavy final thud. Inside the cabin, the noise was dampened to a hum. The interior was lined with cream leather and mahogany. Casey sank into a seat and buckled in. She watched through the window as the helicopter lifted off. The figures of James Victoria and Beatrice shrank rapidly, turning into insignificant dots on the landscape, and then vanishing entirely as the aircraft banked over the Atlantic Ocean. Casey closed her eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. A single tear escaped, tracing a hot line down her cheek. She angrily wiped it away. "We have a flight plan filed for Teterboro, then a transfer to the Global 7500 for London," Mason said from the jump seat, handing her a tablet. "Your father is in Tokyo, but he's been briefed. He sent a message." Casey looked at the tablet. It was a short text from Jonathan Whitmore, head high kid. "Business is business. Come home." Back on the ground, the silence that followed the helicopter's departure was heavier than the noise had been. Victoria Sterling stood in the middle of her ruined flower bed, her heels sinking into the dirt. She was trembling. "Whitmore," Richard Sterling whispered, walking out onto the porch. He looked like he was having a cardiac event. He was clutching his chest, his face grey. "Victoria, do you understand what you just did? She lied to us," Victoria shrieked, trying to regain her composure. "She deceived us, pretending to be a pauper. It's entrapment." "It's a disaster," Richard roared, a vein bulging in his forehead. "Whitmore Logistics owns the majority of our debt, Victoria. The bridge loan that kept the company afloat last month, that came from a Whitmore subsidiary. If Jonathan Whitmore decides to call that loan in because you insulted his daughter, we are destitute. We won't just lose the summer house, we will lose everything." Beatrice covered her mouth. "But she was driving a Honda. She wore polyester." "It was a test," James said, staring at the empty sky. He fell to his knees in the grass. "It was a test and we failed. I failed." "Get up, James," Victoria snapped, though her voice wavered. "We are Sterlings. We do not kneel. We fix this. Richard, call your lawyers. Beatrice, find out where she's going. We will apologize. We will send flowers. We will smooth this over." "You can't smooth over a humiliation like that with flowers, Mother," James whispered, looking at the spot where the helicopter had been. "She looked at me like I was a stranger." "She's gone." "No one is ever gone when there is money involved," Victoria hissed, her eyes narrowing. "She wants to play power games, fine. We'll remind her that the Sterling name still means something in this society." Richard looked at his wife with grim realization. "Victoria, you aren't listening. The Sterling name is just a logo on a sinking ship, and Casey Whitmore just took the lifeboats." 3 days later, the atmosphere in the Sterling household was funeral. The phone hadn't stopped ringing, but it wasn't friends calling to gossip. It was creditors. It started slowly. A credit card declined at the country club, then a freeze on the corporate accounts. By Wednesday morning, the rumors were swirling in the Wall Street Journal. Sterling Industries was being audited. A massive block of their stock was being dumped, driving the price down by 40% in 24 hours. Someone was systematically dismantling them. "It's him," Richard said, pacing the drawing room. The floor was littered with financial papers. "Jonathan Whitmore. He's squeezing us." "We need a meeting," Victoria said. She was dressed in black, looking severe and aged. "We need to talk to Casey. She's a sensible girl. She loved James. She won't let her father destroy us." "She won't take my calls," James said from the couch. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. "I've called 50 times. Blocked." "Then we go to them," Victoria decided. I received a summons this morning. A summons? Beatrice asked. An invitation to the Whitmore Logistics Headquarters in Manhattan, Victoria said, holding up a thick envelope embossed with a silver W. To discuss the future of our partnership. It's a peace offering. I knew it. She wants to negotiate. James looked doubtful. Or she wants to watch us beg. The Whitmore Tower in Manhattan was a monolith of steel and blue glass that pierced the sky looking down on the Empire State Building. The Sterling family arrived in a hired town car. Their personal driver had quit yesterday when his paycheck bounced. They were escorted not to a meeting room, but to the penthouse executive suite. The elevator ride was long and silent. When the doors opened, they were met by a wall of windows offering a panoramic view of the city. The room was vast, cold, and intimidating. A long conference table made of black obsidian sat in the center. "Please have a seat," a sharp-looking assistant said. "Ms. Whitmore will be with you shortly." They sat. James, Richard, Victoria, and Beatrice. They waited for 20 minutes. It was a calculated power move, and it worked. Victoria fidgeted. Richard sweated. Finally, the double doors at the far end of the room opened. Casey walked in. She was unrecognizable from the girl in the navy outlet dress. She wore a tailored white suit that screamed bespoke Italian tailoring. Her hair was sleek, sharp, and professional. She didn't walk. She glided. But the biggest change was her eyes. The warmth was gone. In its place was the hard, polished steel of a CEO. She wasn't alone. Flanking her were 4 lawyers and her father, Jonathan Whitmore. Jonathan was a giant of a man with silver hair and a reputation for eating competitors for breakfast. Casey took the seat at the head of the table. She didn't smile. She didn't say hello. She placed a single file folder on the obsidian surface. "Ms. Whitmore," Victoria began, putting on her best socialite smile. "Casey, darling, it's so good to see you. We've been so worried. That exit the other night was so dramatic. We wanted to clear the air." Casey looked at Victoria for a long, uncomfortable silence. "This is a business meeting, Mrs. Sterling," Casey said coolly. "Please address me as Ms. Whitmore or Chairwoman." Victoria's smile faltered. "Chairwoman? But your father—" "My father is retiring next year," Casey said, gesturing to Jonathan, who sat back with a proud smirk. "I have assumed operational control of the North American division as of yesterday. My first order of business was reviewing our distressed assets. That brings us to Sterling Industries." Richard leaned forward, his hands shaking. "Casey, Ms. Whitmore, we know there are some liquidity issues, but our fundamentals are strong. We just need an extension on the bridge loan. Just a few months." "I've reviewed your fundamentals, Richard," Casey said, opening the folder. "Your company is hemorrhaging cash. You're over-leveraged in real estate, and your management costs, specifically family salaries, and expenses are exorbitant." She pulled out a sheet of paper. "Victoria, you billed the company $200,000 last year for consulting fees." Casey raised an eyebrow. "And Beatrice $150,000 for lifestyle branding." Beatrice shrank in her chair. I do PR." "You post photos of your lunch on Instagram," Casey corrected. "That's not PR. That's theft." "Now see here." Victoria stood up, her face flushing red. "You cannot speak to us like this. We are family, or we were almost family. You are doing this out of spite because I didn't like your painting." Casey closed the folder. The sound echoed like a gunshot. This isn't about the painting, Victoria, Casey said softly. This is about competence and character. You told me that everyone has a price. You tried to buy me off for $50,000. Casey signaled to one of the lawyers, who slid a document across the table to Richard. That document is a notice of default, Casey explained. We are calling in the loan, in full, immediately. We can't pay that, Richard gasped. It's $40 million. We don't have the cash. I know, Casey said, which is why we are exercising the collateral clause. Whitmore Logistics is seizing your assets to satisfy the debt. What assets? James asked, his voice trembling. Casey looked him in the eye. The shipping fleet, the warehouses, and the Newport estate. The room went dead silent. You can't take the house, Victoria whispered, holding the table for support. It's been in the Sterling family for 4 generations. It's our home. It's a house, Casey corrected. And frankly, it's too expensive to maintain. We plan to liquidate it. I believe a developer is interested in tearing it down to build condos. They'll be very reasonable units. Perhaps the kind of place where people like me, the help, can afford to live. You're a monster, Beatrice sobbed. I'm a businesswoman, Casey said, standing up. You mocked my poverty, not realizing that my poverty was a choice. My wealth is a weapon, and you gave me every reason to pull the trigger. Casey, please, James begged, standing up and reaching across the table. Don't do this. I love you. We can start over. I'll leave them. I'll come with you. Casey paused. For a second, her mask slipped. She looked at James with a profound sadness. You had your chance to leave them, James, she said quietly. You sat at that table and watched them tear me apart. You didn't stand up. You just drank your wine. She turned to her father. I'm done here. Excellent work, chairwoman, Jonathan said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. You have 24 hours to vacate the Newport property, Casey said over her shoulder as she walked toward the door. I'd suggest packing. I hear the rental market is terrible this time of year. Casey walked out of the room, leaving the Sterlings in the glass tower, surrounded by the sky with absolutely nothing beneath their feet. The fall of the House of Sterling didn't happen with a bang. It happened with the beep of a reversing truck. It was exactly 24 hours after the disastrous meeting in the glass tower of Whitmore Logistics. The sky over Newport seemed to understand the mood. It had turned a bruised, sullen purple, unleashing a cold, relentless drizzle that soaked everything to the bone. The Atlantic Ocean, usually a picturesque backdrop for the Sterling family's garden parties, looked angry and grey, crashing violently against the cliffs below. A fleet of 3 massive, unmarked black trucks idled on the gravel driveway. They didn't belong to a high-end moving concierge. They belonged to a forensic asset liquidation firm, the kind of company hired to strip a carcass clean. Beatrice Sterling was making a spectacle of herself near the fountain. She was wrestling physically, wrestling with a burly man in a rain poncho over a set of Louis Vuitton steamer trunks. You cannot take these, she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. Rain plastered her hair to her forehead, ruining a blowout that had cost $300. These are personal effects. My initials are monogrammed on the side, B.S. Beatrice Sterling. The man didn't even look at her. He checked a barcode on his clipboard. Everything purchased with company funds is classified as company property, ma'am, he said, his voice bored and monotonous. The audit shows these trunks were expensed as client retention gifts in fiscal year 2021. You kept them. That makes them embezzled assets. They go on the truck. He yanked the handle from her grip. Beatrice slipped in the wet gravel, scraping her knee, but no one moved to help her. The staff, the gardeners, the maids, the chef had all left hours ago, their final paychecks having cleared only thanks to a mercy clause Casey had inserted in the takeover deal. Victoria Sterling sat in the back of a car parked near the gate. It wasn't the Bentley. The Bentley had been repossessed at dawn. It was a rented Ford Taurus Grey and nondescript, smelling faintly of stale cigarette smoke and pine air freshener. Victoria stared straight ahead, her face a mask of porcelain shock. She refused to look at the house. She refused to watch the movers carrying out the 18th century grandfather clock that had ticked in the hallway for 60 years. She refused to watch them roll up the Persian rugs. She was catatonic, her mind unable to process a reality where she wasn't the Queen of Newport. Victoria, roll up the window. Richard muttered from the driver's seat. He looked 10 years older than he had yesterday. His hands, usually steady on the wheel of a yacht, were trembling as he gripped the steering wheel of the Ford. The neighbors are watching. And they were. The eviction of the Sterlings had become the spectator sport of the season. Black Range Rovers and silver Porsches drove by, slowly prowling like sharks, sensing blood in the water. These were people the Sterlings had dined with for decades, people they had hosted for galas. But they didn't stop to offer help. They didn't roll down their windows to offer a guest room or a comforting word. They slowed down just enough to see the tragedy, their faces pressed against the tinted glass, whispering into their phones. In their world, poverty was a contagious disease, and the Sterlings were now patient zero. James was the last to leave the house. He walked out the front door, the heavy oak slamming shut behind him, with a sound that felt like a gavel striking a block. The house was empty now, hollow. Without the furniture, without the art, without the noise of their pretension, it was just a pile of cold limestone. He carried a single cardboard box. It contained a few changes of clothes, his toothbrush, and a photo of him and Casey from when they first started dating, before he had brought her home, before he had let his family destroy her. He walked down the stone steps, the rain soaking through his shirt. As he reached the bottom step, something caught his eye near the rose bushes, Victoria's prized award-winning roses now drooping and battered by the storm. Something was buried in the mud. James walked over his dress shoes, sinking into the wet earth. He crouched down. It was the frame, the cheap, simple frame Casey had brought to dinner. He pulled it out of the muck. The glass was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures running across the surface. The rain had seeped inside. The watercolor painting, which had been a delicate, vibrant depiction of the garden in bloom, was ruined. The colors had bled together, the pinks of the roses merging with the greens of the ivy into a weeping gray mess. It looked exactly how James felt. He wiped the mud off the glass with his sleeve, smearing the dirt, but clearing a small patch so he could see the signature in the corner. S. Whitmore. James. "Get in the car," Victoria snapped from the sedan. Her voice was shrill, desperate to flee the scene of her execution. "We have to get to the motel before dark. I won't be seen checking into a motel in daylight." "The motel?" James repeated the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. He tucked the broken painting under his arm, shielding it from the rain with his body, and got into the cramped back seat of the Ford. As they drove away, the iron gates swung shut behind them, locked by a security guard who used to salute James every morning. Today, the guard simply turned his back and lit a cigarette. 2 weeks later, the reality of their new life had settled in like a heavy fog. They were living in a 2-bedroom apartment in a run-down complex on the outskirts of Providence, ironically only a few miles from the dreadful apartment complex Casey used to live in. But this place was worse. The walls were paper-thin, vibrating with the bass of the neighbor's stereo. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and mildew. The heating vents rattled like dying engines. The silence between the family members was suffocating. Richard spent his days staring at the television, watching financial news, muttering about market manipulation. Victoria lay in bed with the curtains drawn, claiming she had a migraine, refusing to look at the cheap laminate flooring. James sat at the small, wobbly kitchen table, the blue light of his smartphone illuminating his unshaven face. It had been 14 days, and he had applied to 37 jobs. The result was always the same. Sterling. Related to the Sterling Industries bankruptcy. We aren't hiring at the moment. Your family is a liability. The name that used to open boardroom doors was now a toxic mark. It signaled incompetence, scandal, and failure. His phone buzzed in his hand. A news alert. Whitmore Heiress announces new foundation for struggling artists. James's thumb hovered over the screen. He shouldn't click it. He knew it would hurt. He clicked it. A video began to play. It was coverage of a press conference in Manhattan. Casey stood at a podium bathed in camera flashes. She looked breathtaking. She wore a tailored black dress that screamed power and elegance. Her hair was swept back, her makeup flawless. She didn't look like the girl who served tables. She looked like a titan of industry. But it was the person standing next to her that made James's breath catch in his throat. Beside Casey stood a man. He was tall, with broad shoulders and messy sandy blonde hair. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a blazer over a t-shirt, looking effortlessly cool. The caption identified him as Ethan Caldwell, a visionary architect known for sustainable housing projects. In the video, Casey laughed at something Ethan whispered to her. It wasn't a polite socialite laugh. It was a real, full-bodied laugh. Ethan looked at her with a mixture of respect and adoration that James realized with a sickening jolt he had never shown her. "She looks rich," Beatrice said. James jumped. Beatrice was standing behind him, peering over his shoulder. She was wearing stained sweatpants, her hair unwashed and tied in a messy knot. She looked hollowed out. "She looks happy." James corrected his voice, quiet. "Do you think—" Beatrice hesitated, chewing on a fingernail. "Do you think if we called her, if we explained how bad it is, Mom needs her medication and we're behind on the rent for this dump, maybe she'd send us something, just a few thousand. It's pocket change to her now." James stared at the phone screen at Casey's radiant smile. He felt a hot, bubbling anger rise in his chest, not at Casey, but at the pathetic creature his sister had become. At the pathetic creatures they all were. He slammed the phone down on the table. The plastic cracked. "Is that all you think about?" James shouted, standing up. The chair scraped loudly against the cheap linoleum. "Money. We lost her because we treated her like garbage. Beatrice, we treated her like she was nothing because her bank account was empty. And now you want to beg her for cash. Asking for money now would just prove every single thing she said about us was right." "We are garbage, James," Beatrice screamed back, tears streaming down her face. "Look at us. Look at this place. We have nothing. We are nobodies." James looked at his sister. He looked at the closed door of his mother's room. He looked at the broken painting, leaning against the wall near the trash can, where he had placed it to dry. "No," James said. He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair. "I'm not a nobody. and I'm done waiting for a handout." "Where are you going?" Beatrice cried. "I'm going to get a job," James said, buttoning his coat. "A real one. I don't care if it's scrubbing floors or pouring concrete. I'm going to work until my hands bleed if I have to. But I am done being a Sterling." He walked out the door into the smelly hallway, leaving the ruins of his family behind, to finally start building something real. 6 months later. The transformation was complete, not just of the building, but of the woman standing at its center. It was a crisp, biting November evening in New York City. The wind whipped off the East River, rattling the frosted panes of the old industrial district in Dumbo, Brooklyn. But inside the Whitmore Collective, the air was warm, scented with fresh lilies, expensive perfume, and the faint electric buzz of success. Casey had bought the dilapidated warehouse 3 months prior. It had been a shell of rust and broken glass, much like her heart the night she left Newport. Now it was the crown jewel of the city's art scene, a gallery and non-profit dedicated to funding arts education for underprivileged schools. Tonight was the opening gala. The space was cavernous, with soaring ceilings and exposed brick walls that had been sandblasted to a warm terracotta. The lighting was low and amber, designed to make the art pop and the guests look beautiful. And the guests were beautiful. This wasn't the stuffy, judgmental crowd of the Sterling estate, where lineage mattered more than character. This room was filled with innovators, tech moguls, avant-garde sculptors, and philanthropists who actually cared about the causes they signed checks for. Casey stood near a massive abstract oil painting, holding a flute of sparkling water. She wore a gown of deep, shimmering emerald silk that draped over her frame like liquid gem. It was tailored to perfection, bold and unapologetic. The girl who had once tried to shrink herself to fit into a Honda Civic was gone. In her place was Casey Whitmore, chairwoman, patron, and a woman who finally knew her own dimensions. "You have a look on your face," a deep, warm voice rumbled beside her. Casey turned her smile, widening instinctively. Standing there was Ethan Caldwell. He was wearing a tuxedo, but he wore it with the casual ease of a man who didn't need clothes to define his status. Ethan was a renowned architect, the genius behind the city's new sustainable housing initiative, and the man who had helped Casey redesign this very building. "What kind of look?" Casey asked, tilting her head. "The look of someone who is trying to figure out if the catering staff brought enough of those crab cakes," Ethan teased, offering her a small plate. "I grabbed you two. I know you haven't eaten since the board meeting at 8 a.m. Casey took the plate, grateful. "You know me too well, Ethan." "I'm learning," he said softly. His eyes lingered on her face, not with possession, but with admiration. He didn't look at her like an asset to be managed. He looked at her like she was the sun, and he was just happy to be in the orbit. "You did this, Casey. All of this. It's incredible." "We did this," she corrected gently, touching his arm. "I couldn't have done the structural renovations without you." "I just drew the lines," Ethan shrugged. "You provided the soul." A sudden commotion at the front entrance broke the moment. The heavy glass doors, usually guarded by the velvet rope, were being blocked. The hum of conversation in the room didn't stop. But Casey's instincts, honed by months of high-stakes corporate warfare, pricked up. She saw Mason, her head of security, step forward. His broad back blocked the view of whoever was trying to enter. He was shaking his head firmly. "Trouble?" Ethan asked, following her gaze. "I don't know," Casey said, handing him her plate. "Stay here. I'll handle it." "Do you want me to come?" "No," Casey said, smoothing her dress. I think I need to do this alone. She walked across the polished concrete floor. The click of her heels was rhythmic, confident. As she approached the entrance, Mason turned. "Miss Whitmore." Mason said, his voice low. "I have an individual here who insists on seeing you. He's not on the list. I've told him to leave, but he claims he has property of yours." "Let him through, Mason," Casey said quietly. Mason hesitated, then stepped aside. The cold wind from the street rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust, and standing there, shivering slightly in the doorway, was James Sterling. Casey felt her breath hitch, but only for a second. He looked diminished. That was the only word for it. The golden boy of Newport was gone. James had lost at least 15 pounds. His face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharper, his tan faded to a pale winter grey. He wasn't wearing the bespoke suits his mother used to pick out for him. He wore a simple, off-the-rack, button-down shirt that was slightly wrinkled and a pair of trousers that had seen better days. But it was his hands that caught Casey's attention. James, who had never lifted anything heavier than a champagne flute, had hands that were raw red and covered in healing blisters. "Casey," James said. His voice was raspy. He stayed on the threshold, afraid to cross the line into her world. "James?" she replied. Her voice was steady. She searched inside herself for the anger she had felt 6 months ago, the burning rage of the dinner table. It wasn't there. It had burned itself out, leaving only a cool, distant pity. "What are you doing here?" "I saw the article," James said, fumbling with the strap of a canvas bag on his shoulder. "About the opening. I knew I couldn't get a ticket. But I had to come." "If you're here for money, James..." Casey started, her tone hardening slightly. "No," James interjected quickly, holding up his hands. "No. God, no. I'm not here for that, I swear." He took a deep breath, his eyes darting around the opulent room, seeing the success she had built without him. The shame on his face was palpable. "I'm working," he said almost proudly. "Construction, up in Yonkers. It's hard, minimum wage. But I'm learning. I'm paying for my own apartment. It's a studio, and it smells like boiled cabbage, but it's mine. Mom and Dad, they're still blaming everyone else. But I couldn't do it anymore." Casey softened. "I'm glad to hear that, James. Really." "I brought you something," he said. "When the movers came, that day, they were tossing things into the dumpster. I saw this in the mud." He reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a flat rectangular object wrapped in brown butcher paper. He handed it to her with trembling hands. Casey took it. She carefully tore the corner of the paper. It was the watercolor painting. The damage was obvious. The high-quality paper she had used was warped from the rain. The colors of the rose garden had bled together, the pinks and greens, merging into a bruised purple. It wasn't the pristine image she had painted. It was scarred, but it was framed. The frame wasn't the expensive gold leaf of the Sterling estate. It was simple raw pine. The corners were mitered imperfectly, clearly done by hand, by someone who was learning how to use tools for the first time. "I couldn't afford a professional framer," James whispered, looking at his boots. "I did it myself in the evenings. I sanded the wood down. I bought the glass from a hardware store." Casey ran her finger over the rough wood of the frame. "You fixed it." "I tried," James said. He looked up, his eyes wet. "It was the only real thing in that house, Casey. Everything else was fake. The furniture, the friends, the smiles. This This was the only thing that had any love in it. And we threw it in the dirt. He took a step back, the cold wind swirling around him. I know I missed my chance. James continued, his voice cracking. I know I was a coward. I sat there and let them belittle you because I was afraid of losing my allowance. I lost the only thing that actually mattered. He looked past her towards the center of the room, where Ethan was watching protectively. He looks like a good man, James said, forcing a small, sad smile. He looks like he stands up for you. He does, Casey said softly. Good, James nodded. He shoved his raw hands into his pockets. I just wanted to give that back to you. It didn't belong in the mud, and neither did you. Thank you, James, Casey said. She meant it. This means a lot. Goodbye, Casey, James whispered. He turned around. He didn't ask for a second chance. He didn't ask for a loan. He simply turned his collar up against the biting wind and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the Brooklyn street. A man with nothing finally starting to become someone. Casey watched him go until he was just a speck in the dark. Is everything okay? Ethan's voice came from behind her. He placed a warm hand on her lower back, grounding her. Casey looked down at the painting in her hands. It was flawed. It was water-stained. It was imperfect. Yes, Casey said, taking a deep breath. Everything is perfect. That's the painting, Ethan asked, looking at the warped paper. The one from the story. Yes. It's a bit damaged, Ethan noted gently. Do you want me to have Mason put it in the office? Casey shook her head. She turned and walked toward the main gallery wall, the prime spot between $1 million abstract sculpture and a famous photographer's portrait series. There was a small, empty space there. No, Casey said. It goes here. She hooked the rough pine frame onto the wall. Against the pristine white backdrop and the gallery lights, the water-damaged painting stood out. It looked out of place, and yet it commanded attention. Why there? Ethan asked, confused. Casey stepped back, slipping her hand into Ethan's. She looked at the blurred roses and the cheap pine frame. Because it's a reminder, Casey said, her voice strong and clear, that self-worth isn't about the frame you're put in, or the house you live in, or the name you carry. It's about the picture you paint for yourself, even if it gets rained on, even if it gets torn. It's still art. She turned to Ethan, her eyes shining. And besides, she smiled, pulling him toward the music. I think the scars make it more valuable. As they walked back into the warmth of the party, the little watercolor painting remained on the wall. A testament to a girl who was mocked for her poverty, only to realize that her spirit was the only wealth that truly mattered. And that is how Casey Whitmore turned her deepest humiliation into her greatest masterpiece. The Sterlings thought they were breaking a poor waitress, but they were actually forging a diamond. James learned his lesson, but he learned it too late. He found his soul, but he lost the love of his life in the process. It brings us to a hard, undeniable truth. People will often show you exactly who they are when they think you have nothing to offer them. Believe them the first time. The Sterlings loved the status, not the woman. And when the status was stripped away, only the truth remained. So here is my question for you. Have you ever had someone treat you poorly, only to change their tune the moment they realized you had something that they wanted? Or have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved because they couldn't respect you? How did you handle it? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your story might just inspire the next video. If you enjoyed this saga of justice, heartbreak, and redemption, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and tells YouTube you want more stories like this. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a upload. Know your worth, stand your ground, and never let anyone offer you a discount on your own value. Thanks for watching.